Matthew chapter 12. We finally graduated out of chapter 11.
Be 24 before we finish this.
We're going to really zoom today. All right, so chapter 12. So we are in this section, as we've talked about before, kind of in the responses to Jesus. And what we're going to see here in chapter 12 is the negative responses really ramp up to really the rejection of the Messiah here. To the point where we get to chapter 13, he really starts talking about another people, being brought into the fold, i.e. the Gentiles. So we'll see a real strong reaction here as we get into the latter part of chapter 12. and really this has been building up as we've gone through Matthew. The Pharisees have gotten more and more animated in the way that they respond to Jesus, and we'll certainly see that reach ahead here in chapter 12. So what we'll be looking at here in these first few verses is really about the Sabbath. And it said, if you look at verse 1, at that time Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. And so we need to talk a minute about the Sabbath and about the Jewish thinking on the Sabbath, right? So the Sabbath was definitely a key component of their system, of their legalistic system, if you will. It's kind of the heart of it. The word itself simply means to cease, to a complete cessation. When you say Sabbath, that's what it means. It is, keeping the Sabbath was one of the 10 Commandments. In fact, let's turn back there and look at it back in Exodus chapter 20. Just so you have the context of what the Jews are responding to. Exodus chapter 20, verse 8. So mine says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall work and do your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath to the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, you nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, your female servant, your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates. For since 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that is in it, and he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. So I do want you to remember in the back of your heads as we go through this today, the lesson that we had, it may have been 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago now, on the rest, right? And we kind of said that the rest that we had back at the end of chapter 11 was really about salvation. So when we get here and start talking about the Sabbath, and the Sabbath is all about rest, you're going to have to make a connection in your head between the Sabbath and rest and salvation. And we'll be making that more clear as we go, but I just wanted in your head as we go through all this, try to be making the connections between those things. Now, as we've said many times, the Pharisees had, added to what's in the Old Testament, added a bunch of, frankly, ridiculous rules and laws with regard to the Sabbath. And these are the things that Jesus was reacting against. And instead, frankly, of it becoming a day of rest, it became a day of burdens. The amount of things that they had to worry about on the Sabbath. I just have a very small list here of them. In the Talmud, the Jewish writings, they have like 24 chapters of rules regarding the Sabbath. So I mean, I'm just going to share a few of those here. So one of them was you couldn't travel any more than 3,000 feet from your house. Now, unless, of course, you planted food the day before 3,000 feet away, then you could get to that food, and that would be like a second house because the food was there. And then you could go a second 3,000 miles, unless, of course, you planted another set of food 3,000 miles far from that. So it's just insanity, right? And they would say if you put a gate up, that would be like a house. And so you could travel from there another 3,000 miles. So 3,000 feet, rather, not 3,000 miles, 3,000 feet. You couldn't carry a burden that was heavier than a dried fig. You couldn't consume any food that was larger than an olive. If you threw an object in the air and you caught it with your same hand, that was okay. But if you caught it with the other hand, you couldn't do that. That would be carrying a burden. Tailors were not allowed to carry a needle lest they be tempted to sew. And that, of course, would be work. You couldn't dye any wool. You couldn't send a letter. You couldn't make a knot or untie a knot. You can't light a fire. You can't boil an egg. This one's good. You can't take a bath, because if you take a bath, water might spill out of the tub and thereby wash the floor, and you're not allowed to wash the floor. You can't light a candle or blow out a lit candle. You can't look in the mirror, because if you look in the mirror, you might see something on your face that you want to adjust, a smudge, or move your hair, and you're not allowed to do that. You can't spit on the ground. You can only spit on the floor and on a rag. Oh, and if you have false teeth, you have to take them out, because otherwise you'd be carrying a burden. So these were just some of the, again, 24 chapters of these, if you can imagine, of rules around what you can and cannot do on the Sabbath. So, when Jesus talks about the Israelites being heavy laden, they're heavy laden with this insanity, right? With these rules and regulations that the Pharisees had invented to try to define what it meant when God said, "Let the Sabbath be holy." This is what they came to. And of course, what Jesus has tried to do back in chapter 5 and 6 was try to tell them that they completely misunderstood the intention of the law, that it was really about the principles and not about the rules. But they're all about the rules. They love the rules, because again, it was things that they could do, right? It was things that they could follow. They invented rules that they could follow so that they would feel okay about themselves. All right, let's go back to verse 1. So at that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples were hungry, and he began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. And when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath." So first of all, at that time, again, the interpretation here is during the Galilean ministry, during that time, Jesus went through the grain fields. Now, I got to say right up front that Jesus went through the grain fields. If he went more than 3,000 feet, he was in trouble, right? So right off, they got a problem. His disciples were hungry and began to pluck the heads of grain and to eat. And of course, we see the Pharisees reacting against it. Now, what's interesting is he's going through Jesus and the disciples are going through somebody's field, and they are taking some of the grain, right? And they are typically what you would do is take the grain, they rub it between their hands to crush to get the covering off of it, and then they would eat the grains, kind of like eating a handful of nuts. But what's interesting is that this is actually them taking this grain from somebody else's field is actually specifically allowed in Scripture. In fact, I'm going to you don't need to turn if you don't want to, but I'm going to turn to Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 25, and just read it to you. It says, "When you come into your neighbor's standing grain, you may pluck the heads with your hand, but you shall not use a sickle on your neighbor's standing grain," right? So you come into your neighbor's field, you're not allowed to go in there and take a sickle and take down all the grain. But if you need some, if you're going through and you're hungry and you need some, that was specifically allowed in the law. So the Pharisees here are not objecting to them stealing grain. That's not what this was about. It was about actually them doing the work of plucking the grain. And then, what's interesting, right? They think about it as, they're taking the grain. So first they're reaping because they're taking the grain off. And then by rubbing it in their hands, they're threshing. And then typically they would blow on their hands to get all the chaff away, right? So that's winnowing. So in doing this 3 times, they are doing work, and they are, therefore breaking the rules that they have around the Sabbath. So, it's just kind of amazing the level of detail that these Pharisees went into. The other thing is, what's interesting here is that in order for them to see this, obviously the Pharisees are following him into the field. So they are also traveling, right, in order to follow Jesus into the field. And it is interesting to me always that the Pharisees are following him around, trying to find something that they can get on him. So again, it's, to them, this is, they're saying it's not lawful, but when they say lawful, they're talking about their laws. They're talking about the rules that they have invented. And again, they've completely distorted God's intention around what the Sabbath is. And we'll get back to that in a minute. So again, verse 3 says, "But he said to him, have you not read what David did when he was hungry, he and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and ate the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those who were with him, but only for the priests?" I got to say right up front, right, have you not read? This is a slap in the face to these guys, right? These are the most read, the most learned guys, the Pharisees and the scribes, right? So when he says, have you not read, this is sarcasm at its best, right, when he says that. And he's talking about David. Obviously, David, a big deal in the way the Jewish thought about their ancestors. I want you to turn to 1 Samuel chapter 21. This is where the story is. Let's make sure we understand the story and then understand what David did here. So in 1 Samuel chapter 21, David actually here is running from Saul. And he gets to the city of Nob in verse 21, verse 1. I'll let you get there. First Samuel is right before 2 Samuel. All right, 1 Samuel 21. Let's just read it. Verse 1. Now David came to Nob, to Amalek the priest, and Amalek was afraid when he met David and said to him, "Why are you alone and no one with you?" So David said to Amalek the priest, "The king has ordered me on some business and said to me, 'Do not let anyone know anything about the business which I send you or what I have commanded you.'" Now, by the way, David is flat out lying there, right? The king, Saul, has not ordered him to do anything. In fact, he's chasing him, trying to kill him. Now, the rest of that says, "And I have directed my young men to such and such a place." So the people that are following David are outside, but he comes in to the city, meets with the priest. Verse 3, "Now therefore, what have you on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread in my hand, and whatever can be found." And the priest answered David and said, "There is no common bread on hand, but there is holy bread. If the young men have at least kept themselves from women." Then David answered the priest and said, "Truly women have been kept from us about 3 days since I came out. And the vessels of the young men are holy. The bread is in effect common, even though it was consecrated in the vessel this day." So the priest gave him the holy bread, and there was no bread there but the showbread, which had been taken from before the Lord in order to put hot bread in its place on the day when it was taken away. So let me just help you understand this showbread business. So in the temple, one of the things that the priests had to do, they baked large loaves. When I say large, I'm talking, a couple feet in size kind of loaves of bread, and there would be 12 of those to represent the 12 tribes. These would be put on the altar as a representation to God of the 12 tribes, of the sacrifice and of the obedience of the 12 tribes, their relationship with God. These would be put on the Sabbath on the altar. They'd stay there all week, and then they would be replaced by fresh bread the next Sabbath. If you go back into the rules in Deuteronomy, it tells you that this bread was only to be eaten by the priests and not by anyone else. So what David has done here is he's come in, he's asked for some bread. The priest said the only bread is the showbread, is this special bread, and he gives that to David. David then takes it and he goes out and feeds himself and feeds his men with that bread. So Jesus is pointing this out and saying, don't you remember what David did? That David, when he was in need, when he was hungry, he did this thing which really went against the rituals that were in place relative to the showbread. So what Jesus is saying here is that the rituals that are in place, now remember again that the rituals are all in place as signs, right? As shadows of what Jesus was to bring later. And he's saying here that these shadows are not the important thing. What's important is the reality, and the reality is that Jesus is there with them. Jesus is there, as the Messiah, and he's saying, compared to these rituals, you have something here very, very much more than those rituals. In the same way that David, because he needed bread for his men, could overcome those rituals. In the same way, when my disciples are hungry, that is more important than these rituals that you have in place. And we'll talk more about that as we get into the rest of the details that he has here, the other examples that he has. But he's essentially saying that, the point he's trying to make, if David can bypass the rituals, then certainly I can bypass your made up rituals of not crushing grain, etc. on the Sabbath, right? If David can bypass the ritual of the showbread that God has laid out, I can certainly bypass the ritual that you men have laid out relative to the Sabbath. All right, so let's keep going, then we'll come back to the broader principle there. Verse 5. It said, or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temples profane the Sabbath and are blameless? Yet I say to you that in this place there is one greater than the temple. So first, again, have you not read? He's slapping them in the face. This is sarcasm. Have you not read, right, that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath? So what he's talking about there is, on the Sabbath, the priests have to work, right? The priests still have to make sacrifices. The priests have to put things, lift burdens up onto the altar. They have to light candles. They have to extinguish candles. And he's saying here, by doing that, they are profaning the Sabbath, right? They are breaking this ritual of the Sabbath by doing this other thing that is more important than the Sabbath. So again, Jesus is trying to help them understand that the Sabbath is a ritual, the Sabbath is important, but compared to other things, it's less important, right? There are other things more important than the Sabbath. In this particular case, he's saying that the work of the priests, the ministry, the worship of the priests in the temple are more important than the priests keeping the Sabbath. Right, so you have so look at verse the next one, right? Verse 6. Yet I say to you that in this place there is one greater than the temple. So mine says there is one greater than the temple. Does your translation say anything else?
Mine says that in this place is one greater.
Okay, anybody have anything else?
Yeah, the NIV says, I tell you that something greater than the temple is here.
That's what mine has.
Yeah, the word something is actually what's in the Greek, not the one. That's an interpretation of what the something is, right? Something is actually the correct translation of what's in the Greek. So he's saying here there's something greater than the temple here. So there are a variety of interpretations of that. All of them are interesting and good. And the first one obviously is that he's talking about himself. And that's why, in mine and several of yours, it says there is one greater than the temple, where he's talking about himself. The other interpretation, because Let's see. Yeah, let's turn to John chapter 2. Just to remind you of these verses that you know. In John chapter 2, verse 19. So Jesus is here in the midst of cleansing the temple. And in the midst of that, in verse 19, John 2:19, he says, Jesus answered and said to him, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. Right here, he's making the transition between the temple as a physical building and the temple as himself, right? He's essentially talking about himself, his own death and resurrection in 3 days. So here he makes the relationship between the temple and himself as the temple. The other thing I want to show you is in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, there's another one, a different one, again, that you remember. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 19, 1 Corinthians 6:19, it says, or do you not know that your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit, who is in you, whom you have from God, and you are not your own? So one of the interesting interpretations here, first, as I said, is that that when he's talking about what's greater here is himself. He's greater than the temple, and certainly there's no question about that. The other one he's saying is that these disciples of mine are greater than the temple, right? These disciples of mine who will be hosts to the Holy Spirit are greater than this temple, right? And they deserve the same kind of respect as the temple is, right? So why did the priests not have to keep the Sabbath? Because they were working in the temple for God, right? And he's saying here the disciples who are temples, who are working for me, deserve the same kind of respect, the same kind of relationship to the Sabbath as the temple does. So it's just another interesting way to understand those verses. Either way, the point he's trying to make is that either him or his disciples, what is going on before them in Christ's work is certainly greater than the temple. And so if in the midst of Christ's work, they need to break one of their little rules with regard to, plucking a head, that is certainly okay, because there's something much greater going on here than just some little rule that the Pharisees have put in place. Okay with that? Let's keep going. We're going to roll these together at the end, but verse 7. So, but if you had known, again, it's sarcasm. This is the third time he's slapping in the face. But if you had known what this means, if you had understood your Bible, if you had understood the intent that God has said, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. For the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Right? So, if you had known, if you had understood, right, that God desires mercy more than sacrifice, that God desires moral principles more than following rules, right? Which is again taking us right back to the sermon, right, where he was trying to tell them when he talked about adultery and he talked about murder, right, that it was about the principles and not about the specific rules that you have in place. He's saying the same thing here, right? And in fact, I didn't write it down. That's always a mistake. Of course, I can't find it now. Yeah. So back in chapter 5, right? Verse 17. Do not think that I came to destroy the law of the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill, right? So, and for surely I say to you, till the heaven and earth pass away, not one jot, one tittle will by no means pass until the law has been fulfilled, right? So he is, he's saying to them over and over again, it's the principles, it's the intent behind the law. You guys have messed up. You guys have added a bunch of rules on there, and that was not what the intent was about at all. They were moral principles. They were not rules. If you had understood the intent of Scripture and not just the rules, and in fact, what the Pharisees have done have inverted the priority of sacrifice over mercy, right? He's saying mercy is more important than sacrifice, and they were saying sacrifice is more important than mercy. In other words, doing works is more important than doing good. And Jesus is trying to tell them here, no, this is about doing good, not about doing works. And then he adds verse 8, for the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath, which has got to be one of those things that they would react to very strongly, right? That the Son of Man, obviously he's talking about himself there, is Lord of the Sabbath. What he's really saying there is, I started the Sabbath. The Sabbath was my idea. I initiated it, and I get to interpret it. I get to say what it's about, not you guys. I'm in charge of the Sabbath. I am, right? I am is in charge of the Sabbath. And as we just read in Matthew 5, right, he says, I fulfilled all of the Old Testament law. I fulfilled the Sabbath, which takes us right back to rest, right? Which we spent some time on a couple of weeks ago, and we looked at Hebrews chapter 4 and 5, right? That we have entered into this rest. We have entered into this salvation. We had entered into this relationship with Christ. And in that way, he has fulfilled the Sabbath. The shadow, the ceremony, by the way, of the 10 commandments, 9 of them are moral instructions. One of them is ceremonial. The ceremonial one is this one about keeping the Sabbath, right? It's the only ceremonial rule in the 10 commandments. The rest are all moral rules. So here he's saying, and if you remember when we talked back in Matthew chapter 5, that Christ fulfills all of the ceremonial laws, right? All of the shadows, all of the things laid on the altar, all of the sacrifices, right? He fulfills all those with his life and his death. And so again, he's saying, I am the Lord of the Sabbath. I have fulfilled the Sabbath, fulfilled all of the law and the prophets. So look at the way Paul talks about this in Colossians. Turn there a minute to Colossians. Right after Philippians, Colossians chapter 2. Colossians 2, verse 16. Right? Colossians 2:16 says, so let no one judge you in food or in drink or regarding a festival or new moons or Sabbaths, which are a shadow of things to come, but the substance is of Christ. That's a powerful statement, right? So remember what happens while Jesus is on the earth with the disciples, he is certainly keeping the Sabbath, right? Honoring the Sabbath. But then after he leaves, the disciples move to worshiping on Sunday, right? Which is really a celebration of the Lord's resurrection. And essentially, Paul is giving these instructions here saying, you don't need to worry about Sabbath anymore because Christ has fulfilled the Sabbath. That was a shadow of things to come. Christ is the substance of it. So I think that sometimes we falsely think, well, what they did was they moved the Sabbath from Saturday to Sunday. No, the Sabbath was wiped out. The Sabbath was gone. The Sabbath is fulfilled. The Sabbath is over. Now we have a different thing on Sunday. It's a celebration of the resurrection. So, I'll be honest with you. I can remember growing up and being, right? Some of you will remember this. I can remember growing up and being taught what I could and could not do on the Sabbath, i.e. Sunday, right? And I think that unfortunately that was a complete misinterpretation of again what the Sabbath was and what Sunday is. So you can certainly ask the question, what can you do on Sunday and what can you not do on Sunday? But it's not the same question of what can you do on the Sabbath and what can you not do on the Sabbath. Those are two different questions. I'm going to just pause there and see if you have any thoughts, reactions about that. No, just me? I was the only one who had a weird childhood?
No, I remember having restrictions. I can't remember exactly what they were. There were things that we couldn't do. I think one of the things that was in that list was we couldn't go shopping.
Yep.
Doors were
Blue laws.
closed back
Blue
then.
laws.
Yeah, stores were closed on Sundays, but
Yeah, the grocery.
My mother was very strict about not sewing on Sunday.
Yep. Yeah, so I think all that, the blue laws, all those things, I can remember, there was things that we were not allowed to do on Sundays. We certainly couldn't go to the store, but yeah, it was, and I think that, so it's one of those things, throwing out the baby with the bathwater kind of thing, right? Does that mean you can do whatever you want on Sunday? Does that mean you can do whatever you want on Sunday?
not any more than any other day.
Yeah, there you go. Right? Right? That's exactly right. You can do whatever you want as long as whatever you want is what God wants, right? It's that, but we don't want to get caught up in the legalistic system of the Sabbath. That again is something that Christ has fulfilled.
I do
All right.
remember. I
Yeah.
do remember having some conversations in my younger, I guess it was teenage Sunday school class, with the teacher that was teaching, because we would talk about what would be considered work and what would be considered play. I mean, because you could deem anything, if you really wanted to, you could deem anything as not work. I mean, because people like to work on their cars, so it's a pleasure activity for some people. Some people it's work. I mean, I can still remember some of those conversations that you mentioned about what's work and what's play and what we should be doing and what we shouldn't. I can remember those conversations.
Yep.
And Rich, I guess Paul runs into this big time with the Galatians, where they're saying, Christ is good, but you got to still follow all these Jewish things, and so he hammers them pretty hard on all that. But we still kind of do that today. We have unwritten rules that we have for church, and you got to dress a certain way, or you got to whatever, like you're saying. There's Sabbath, but for all kinds of things we do in church.
Yeah. But what's interesting is we got to really think, again, it's the fundamental question that I ask over and over. Why am I doing the things that I'm doing? Right? Why are you doing it? Right? Is it because I'm trying to follow some Sabbath law around work or dress or whatever? Or is it because of my relationship with God and I want to honor him? Right? Why am I doing the things I'm doing is the fundamental question that, in all of these things. And unfortunately, I think, as CT and the rest of you all have said, that the church at one time, I believe, was teaching a Sabbath set of rules for Sunday. And so it's gotten mixed up in our head. It was mixed up in the church's head for a long time, and I'm sure still is on many. But that is just That is not why we honor God. That is not why we come to church. That is not why we study. That is not why we might try to wear nice clothes when we come on Sunday, right? It's not about following a set of rules. And that, because again, it's either the Pharisees' rules or the rules that are made up by some church around what we should do, right? But either of those is wrong because it's not about a set of rules.
I remember having discussions about things, so we do things in church now on Sunday that would be considered work. You know, but there's I guess there's also a, like you said, there's an attitude or why are you doing this? And so we're doing these things on Sunday to reach people for Christ. And so it kind of is work, but it's God's work.
Well, are you allowed to work on Sundays, DT?
Absolutely. So you have to be allowed to work if you do. Or you do. Yeah.
Yeah.
Put the fire out of your house that's on fire.
Most of the staff here works on
So
Sunday.
that's the staff, that's the work, people working here at church.
See, this is exactly Jesus's argument, right? He's saying, the priests in the temple work on Sundays, right? And he's saying that that's a ridiculous rule around the Sabbath because they have to do their work. And why is it? Because they are worshiping God. They are doing things for God. So essentially he's saying anything that you're doing for God, any worship that you have for God is okay on any day. And if, getting back to, I think Rick said it the best, right? The Sabbath Sunday should be no different than any other day as far as what you can and cannot do. It should be different from no other day. You should do what is good. You should do what is right. You should do what is holy on every day. Now, we set aside a special day to remember the resurrection, to remember, right, what he has done for us. And that's a good thing, right? That's a great blessing. But there should not be a set of rules associated with what we can and cannot do on that day. That's not the point. Anybody want to push back any? I could be completely wrong here. So anybody? I'll continue to argue, but all right.
I get this from kind of a different perspective. When God first called me, I was, in high school, and when I got my call, and my first Christian experience was as a Seventh-day Adventist. And I went for years as a Seventh-day Adventist, went to schools as a Seventh-day Adventist, and this whole Sabbath thing was just ingrained in me. And then I had my Moses period where I wandered in the desert for 30 some odd years and came back. And when I came back, we came back into the Baptist church, and this ate a hole in me for a long, long time, this Sabbath thing. And I started teaching a Sunday school class, and I took them through the book of Romans, like you're doing here, verse by verse. And when I finished that study in Romans, the Sabbath question was gone, and it's never bothered me again since.
Yeah, Romans will do that to you.
Yeah.
And a lot of things.
Yeah.
Absolutely. All right. Good. All right, let's go on a little bit. We're going on to verse 9. Where are we? We're good. Verse 9. Now, when he had departed from there, he went into their synagogue. I love this, by the way. He's in the field. He's having this discussion with the Pharisees. And, they get into this little disagreement, obviously. And the first thing he does is goes into the synagogue. He goes right into the viper's den, if you will, right in where all the Pharisees are. I just find that really fascinating. And he confronts the Pharisees now on their terms. Verse 10, and behold, there was a man who had a withered hand, and they asked him, saying, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath, that they might accuse him, right? So don't ever miss the word behold, right? Again, every time you see that, that means something cool is about to happen. So they asked him, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? And again, that they might accuse him. They were just trying to set him up, trying to find him, find him doing something wrong. And so they're asking him if it's okay to heal on the Sabbath. And, Jesus's response is just beautiful. Verse 11, then he said to them, what man is there among you who has one sheep, and if it falls into the pit on the Sabbath, will not lay hold of it and lift it out? Right. So he's saying to them, let's take another example. Let's look at let's look at your sheep. Now, in the if you go back to again to Deuteronomy and following, right, it does actually talk about what if you have one of your sheep fall into the pit. And what it says is that if it's about to die, then you can take it out. If it's not going to die, then you can throw down some pillows so it will be comfortable, and you'll throw down some food so it'll have something to eat, and then you can pull it out the next day, right? I mean, just the pure insanity of it. And so obviously, practically what went on was if people had a sheep that fell into a pit, they pulled it out, right? Because they were afraid that it was going to die, or they would say they were afraid it was going to die. So that gave them an excuse to be able to take it out. And so he's saying practically what's going on is when a sheep falls in the pit, you take care of it and you pull it out, right? And again, this is he's a little bit here of pushing on them about their economics, if you will, versus the real following the law, right? They're, if they have a sheep, this is their livelihood. You're certainly going to take care of your livelihood and your money, if you will, of that sheep that's down there. And then look how he connects it in verse 12. Of how much more value than is a man than a sheep. Therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath, right? How much more value is a man than a sheep, right? Certainly, doing good to a man is more important than doing good to a sheep. Worrying about a man and his value is more important than worrying about a sheep and his value. Therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath, right? It's always lawful to do good. And I think that, one lesson you got to get out of this is good left undone is evil, right? He's saying if I have a man with a withered hand and I do not heal him, then I have left good undone, which is evil. So it's always right to do good on the Sabbath. And you see him how he takes it on then in verse 13. And then he said to the man, stretch out your hand. And he stretched it out, and it was restored as whole as the other. And this story is in Mark and Luke. And in those places, both it says he asked the man to come forward. In other words, he got the man right in front of the whole crowd so that everybody could see it. And then he said, stretch out your hand. It is interesting. When we talk about the man with a withered hand, most of the commentaries agree that this is probably something that, he had a withered arm, really. So when Jesus says, stretch out your hand, the man might have responded, I can't, I don't have the ability to stretch out my hand. But of course, he does. He responds in obedience to what Jesus has said, even though he may have thought he couldn't do it. And the restoration is complete. And is restored as whole as the other. And then, of course, you love verse 14, right? Then the Pharisees went out and plotted against him how they might destroy him. Again, in Luke, it says they were filled with fury. And in Mark, it says that Jesus was grieved when he saw them. He's grieved when he sees the way that they have messed up the intent of what God had said, right? God had put the Sabbath in place for man, for rest, for his benefit, and they've turned it around into a burden, into something that's put on them, right? So the thing that I like here is that Jesus has connected the Sabbath with the heart of God, with doing good, with mercy, right? With love. He's connecting those two things together. And so we've got to ask the question, right? Are we defining our Christianity as a list of things to do and not do? Or is it about mercy? Is it about doing good? Is it about love? Is it about rest? Right? I'm wrapping up. How about that? Turn to Mark chapter 2. Just show you there's one additional verse here in Mark that's not in Matthew. Mark 2:27. Right? Mark 2:27. The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. So again, let's connect this back to our lesson on rest, right? Salvation is for man and not man for salvation, right? Therefore, the Son of Man is the Lord of salvation, is the Lord of rest, is the Lord of salvation. All of those words can be used interchangeably here. He's saying that Jesus is the one who makes salvation for man. It's not about, in other words, he's saying it's not about the works of man that bring about salvation. It's about salvation bringing about the fulfillment of man, the salvation of man. So I'm done. I just went through 14 verses and I got done early. Huh? See how fast I am? I'm just the quickest Bible teacher you've ever had.
Listen, Pastor, just
Any questions on this, though? I know this can be tricky, as Bill has said. It's and as CT has said, it's something that we went through a lot when we were younger in one way or another. And so this idea of the Sabbath and Sunday sometimes can get us a little messed up in the way we think about it. Any other thoughts on that? Are you okay? Again, I think it's the freedom of Christ, right? The freedom to do as, Jesus said, essentially, you can do whatever you want as long as you love God. Right? You can do whatever you want as long as you love God. That's the freedom. That's the joy. That's the rest. It's not the burdens. It's not the trying to. If we can get a real hold on that, I think it changes our Christian experience.
That last word you said, as long as you love God, well, yeah, you can do whatever you want as long as you love God, but loving God involves obeying his commandments.
Yeah. Obedience is in there. Right.
Question, is it wrong to cut grass on Sunday?
No, because we're all gonna do it today, so.
You say that in jest, but, and I was raised the same way, that certain things you didn't do, but it's wrong for me to give that image to my neighbors that they don't go to church, but I do, and I honor this day, and so, no, I could cut my grass if nobody was around in the neighborhood, but I don't, because I want to have a good witness.
Ken, you raised a really good point, and I don't want to smooth over it too quickly, right? I mean, the Bible does very much teach us not to put anything in the way of a brother that will make him stumble, right? And if this causes someone to stumble, that they see you out cutting your grass, or they see you doing something else or saying something, right, that by the general population believes Christians should not do, and it causes them to stumble, then causes them to keep them from Christ. Yeah, he says that you ought to restrain yourself. So I understand that thinking. I get it.
And so I thought when Bill mentioned he was Seventh-day Adventist and then he became Baptist, so the first thing that popped into my mind was consumption of alcohol. And so you're almost changed from one thing to another thing that is kind of ingrained in a particular belief system. And it's really, like I said, it's what you are trying to show for the people, to draw people to Christ. And how can you do what's best to draw people to Christ?
Right. We've talked about this before. I mean, the Bible doesn't actually teach that you should not drink alcohol, right? It does teach that you should not be drunk. But to Ken's point, if I'm causing someone to stumble by them seeing me drinking alcohol, then I'm causing them to sin, right? And then I'm sinning myself by doing that. So there's some personal responsibility in there.
There's nothing in either Old or New Testament that says you can't cut your grass.
You can't help your neighbor.
Yeah.
You cut your neighbor's grass, just not your grass. Yeah.
Go out and buy a sheep, they'll cut your grass for you.
If they fall in a hole.
If they fall in the hole, you can pull them out.
There's some grass in there.
All right. All right, let's move into prayer requests. Joe, anything from here?
Recording.
Thank you. Okay. All right, go ahead.